Welcome to J Life with Daniel. I am your host, Rabbi Daniel Levine. Today we are back with Professor David Graizbord, the Director of Jewish Studies at University of Arizona. David, welcome back.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So, whenever anybody asks me what some of my favorite episodes are, I always ask them, are you talking about the interesting academic episodes or the episodes where I kind of just, riff on, whatever is in the news about politics or culture? And if they say academic episodes, I always send them our previous conversation about Jewish identity in the Inquisition, which is the main topic of your research. We talked all about how, starting in 1492, but really throughout the 1500s and early 1600s, Jewish identity throughout Spain and Portugal and anywhere that was controlled by the Inquisition really became extremely difficult to define because at one point Jews were seen as more of a religion in the 1300s, and then by the 1500s there were no quote unquote Jews left in Spain or Portugal, but of course there were still people who descended from Jews, so identity sort of switched to a ethnic. There's sort of another story that's circulating around this time period that I wanted to discuss, and that's messianism. And I thought, there's so many different places to start, but I thought I'd ask with sort of a general question that I know a lot of scholars of mysticism ask, which is, one, how would you define mysticism? And I think more interestingly, is mysticism an inherent part of religious traditions, or is mysticism sort of acquired baggage? In other words, is there something inherent within any time you're religious and you believe in God and have, some dogmas and some actions, is that de facto mysticism, or does mysticism sort of, come from elsewhere?
Mhm. Well, scholars of religion and cultural anthropologists and people like them, they usually define mysticism as a search for a particular kind of experience, an experience that is intuitive, deeply felt, very powerful emotionally, and that in one way or another defies or somehow transcends intellectual perception. Um, Now, the question has arisen among scholars of the Jews, do Jews have something like that? The answer, I think, the short answer is yes, in as much as there are various schools of Jewish esotericism through the centuries that are invested in seeking such experiences, although let's say, the intellectual component is much more highly developed than it is perhaps in other traditions. Um, uh, you know, uh, uh, Judaism after the Second Temple, or even during the Second Temple era, developed into a very textually oriented, linguistically oriented culture. And so the vast majority of what are called mystical texts in the Jewish tradition, or in various Jewish traditions, are written up as midrashim. In other words, as commentaries on the canon, right? That are intended to be understood intellectually, and in that sense, violate one of the main, or at least attenuate one of the main aspects of mysticism writ large. I really, I think it's fine to say that it's not possible to equate, let's say, the mysticism of somebody like Saint Francis of Assisi and Avraham Abulafia, even though there are some points of contact, some similarities, some isomorphisms. Yeah, I mean, one is a highly, let's say, a confessional sort of mysticism based on the experiences of one individual, but not necessarily mediated by any texts. In the case of Abulafia and people like him, the text is always there. In fact, it's the contact, the deep spiritual contact with the letters that make up the Jewish canon that, in essence, um, cause the mystic, or the, let's say, the what would you call Abulafia, the spiritualist, the Kabbalist, right? The wielder of tradition. That's what Kabbalah means. That cause him to have this sort of transcendent experience.
Amazing. So we'll get back to Abu
Yeah.
Afia for listeners that are new to the topic of mysticism and messianism, just to whet your appetite and convince you to stay listening. Abu Afia did try to overthrow the Pope sometime in the medieval ages because he thought he was the Messiah. We'll get back to that, maybe in 10 minutes. Talking about, sort of inherently connected to mysticism, at least in the eyes of a lot of scholars, is is messianism, right? It's only a short leap between thinking that the whole world is sort of enchanted, to use, I guess, an overly academic word, to then somebody thinking, I am the most enchanted and I am here to sort of, save humanity. You obviously have this starting off in the Tanakh, right? You have a lot of, messianism, even though you don't have any of the prophets claiming to be the Messiah, but you see in, Yeshayahu or Isaiah or Jeremiah, Yirmiyahu, right? Talking a lot about this messianism, even more so in the later books, Daniel and such. What's interesting, and what I've sort of noticed, and this is something that of course other people have noticed before, is it's always opposed to the more legalistic tradition of Judaism, right? So if you read the book of Vayikra or Leviticus, right, where it's just endless laws and rules, or even Deuteronomy, which is, all these rules about, how to do everything from, I don't know, keeping Shabbat to, sacrifices in the temple, there's almost zero mysticism, right? And so it almost creates this dichotomy. And I wonder if you think this is a real dichotomy or a false dichotomy between a very legalistic type of religion, which is, Judaism has been extremely legalistic for most of its history. And then on the flip side, you sort of have the messianic and mystic impulse, which almost necessarily part of that is to overthrow the sort of strict legalese because there's nothing less inherently mystical than, yes, you have rules governing every single thing you do, and you know exactly what your day is going to look like for the next, I don't know, 80 years. So I'm wondering, if, because there obviously have been, I guess I'll take a step back, when you read writings from the last, 50 years, so I grew up in the modern Orthodox community, so everybody grew up reading Rav Soloveitchik, who wrote, an important work called Halachic Man, where he was, extremely legalistic in his outlook on Judaism, and he almost attempted to spin that into a mystical approach, right? So Halachic Man, I would almost define as a, mystical legal work, but that's rare, right? Most legalists, right, you don't see a lot of, lawyers who spend their time writing, I don't know, these massive contracts, right? You don't think of them as the creative artists that are also sitting there, painting the murals. So I mean, is this just a dichotomy that's always existed in Judaism? You have the sort of, either priestly types or rabbinic types that are sitting there thinking about the nuances of every single law and how to celebrate holidays, and then on the sort of other side you have these sort of mystics or prophets or, messianists that are sitting there, thinking way more grand than, I don't know, whether or not if my spoon falls into a vat of cholent after I've used it for, milk, so is this a real dichotomy, or is this just something that we paint?
So I think there's something to calling it a dichotomy. I mean, for reasons of analysis, we may definitely distinguish between a tradition of legal thinking and legal narratives and the application of law on one hand, and the search for a certain kind of understanding of God that is not uh, dependent upon, let's say, the hows and the wherefores of halacha, yeah, of Jewish law. Fair enough. But at the same time, I think we have to qualify, right? I mean, the very notion that that the Israelites and therefore their Judaic descendants, their Judean descendants, are a people distinguished culturally by a divinely given law relies upon some acknowledgement of mystical encounters between themselves and their or their ancestors at least, and a deity, right? I mean, if we look, for example, at the first covenant that, according to the Tanakh, to the Hebrew Bible, God forges with Abraham. Well, this is fundamental. I mean, if we read the narratives, they are fundamentally describing a mystical encounter, right? It's not an encounter that's full of, smoke and fire and things like that, but it's a very, it's a very intimate relationship between a deity and a human being. Moses is, excuse me, not Moses, Abraham is hanging out in Ur, or or he's on his way to the land that later becomes known as the land of Israel, and God appears to him, or God speaks to him, and that's it. It's direct contact, unmediated contact with a deity. That is a mystical encounter. In other narratives of the Tanakh, the encounters are much more, let's say, complex visually, in terms of the experience of hearing. They are described in much more poetic terms than the encounters between the patriarchs and the matriarchs on one hand, and their God on the other. So we have, the encounter between Moses and a burning bush that won't be consumed. We have the incredible light and sound show at the foot of Mount Sinai. Not at the foot of Mount Sinai. The people are at the foot of Mount Sinai, and Mount Sinai is, sort of surrounded by all this noise and fire and smoke and so forth. These are mystical encounters, and of course, they are the very encounters that are the sine qua non, the prerequisites for the reception of, the acknowledgement of, and therefore the ultimate application of law. So yes, there's a dichotomy, but I think we have to also be conscious of the connections between a mystical conception, a poetic conception that is expressed, for example, um, in the Nevi'im, in the prophetic narratives, and of course, a legal conception, which the prophets themselves are supporting. Yeah, I mean, the prophecies of Yeshayahu, Isaiah, of Yechezkel, Ezekiel, Daniel, so forth, are all premised on the notion that God will eventually be rejoined with the people, and that one way to achieve redemption for the people is to observe the law, right? And so law and mystical access to the divine are very much intertwined. They're always part of the same discourse.
Yeah, so I'm going to bring in Jesus and Paul in a second. So just a heads up where I want to go with this. But and just to, I don't know if this is pushing back or, adding some color here, eventually, your point is totally granted, right? Beginning of, any type of at least revealed religious experience, even though, what is interesting, and I don't want to go down this tangent, but I will just flag, some later, medieval Jewish thinkers, I think, felt uncomfortable with this revelation part. So almost tried to make that more rationalist, legal. There's a whole
Sure.
debate about what exactly Maimonides believed, but one reading of Maimonides could be his view of Moses was much more like Plato's philosopher
Yeah.
king of just, you know,
Absolutely. If I may interject,
go for
sorry
it.
to interrupt you, but I forgot to mention that, yes, that rabbinic Judaism in particular, not exclusively, but in particular, tends to try to separate let's say, the mystical from the legal. Yeah. And I wouldn't call it legalistic because that sounds a little bit like a slur. I mean, um, Judaism has a legal foundation as we understand it. Parenthetically, I don't really like the word Judaism. It's not a Jewish term, but whatever. The Jewish civilization has a legal foundation and legal presuppositions, right? Um, and it fell to the rabbis after the fall of the Second Temple, especially, to say, in their words, it is not in the heavens. In other words, the era of prophecy, the era of direct unmediated contact with the deity is over, and it falls to us to determine, even though we acknowledge that for example, a bat kol, a divine voice can be heard by us from heaven. Even though we acknowledge that, we know that now it is our obligation to understand law and to probe our texts to reveal God's will in our earthly endeavors.
Yeah,
So
well, this is
that's
almost the,
important.
I mean, to some extent, if you have a religious institution, right, the problem with legalism, and, this is, Paul and Jesus's critique, as is many Jewish critiques later, is it becomes overly institutionalized, right? What starts off, you do something for a deeply spiritual purpose, almost just becomes a routine checklist of things that you have to do. And so there's always going to be these impulses of people trying to challenge this from
Correct.
more
Correct.
spiritual, creative, but then you get to
Yes.
the, as you said before, you sort of just alluded to this, but just to spell it out, in sort of one of the central texts of the Talmud, the rabbis are having a legal debate, and one of the rabbis is pulling off all these miracles to defend his position, and the miracles are going his way. In other words, this guy's a miracle worker. He clearly is in some touch with some spiritual or divine power. And then eventually, as you said before, God actually comes down and says, Rabbi Eliezer is correct. And the rabbis reject it and basically say, this is in, the human's court now. They quote some verse for Deuteronomy, in classic midrashic sense, obviously out of context, but they say, it says in Deuteronomy, lo b'shamayim, right? The Torah is not in heaven, therefore it's in our court. So, what might have started off, something very similar eventually does, at least in my reading, become this, you have this overly institutionalized religious system that, might be called, the priests or the rabbis or whatever. And then on the flip side, you have these people that are outside, sort of banging on the door saying, we need to do this and
Right,
change.
right. So in that sense, you're right that in as much as we can identify a Jewish mysticism, it is very often a reaction to or a rejection of legalism. What I wanted to make clear is that I wouldn't call the culture as a whole legalistic. I would call it legal, but that's all.
No, no, totally fair. So the first great, both messianist and also, antinomian, right, anti-legal criticism of Judaism comes from early Christianity, of course. Both Jesus and Paul were Jews, so this is, obviously what became two different traditions by, I don't know, the third century CE. If we both took a time machine and popped into Jerusalem of the first century, I always tell students, you would have, the same way you walk down the street now and there's, I don't know, Reform and Reconstructionist and Conservative and Orthodox, you would be walking down the street in Jerusalem in, I don't know, the year 50, and there'd probably be like, oh, this is a Jesus-centric synagogue and this is a non-Jesus-centric synagogue, or, whatever the equivalent was. So, early Christianity was much more a sect of Judaism than this other religious tradition. But Paul has this criticism of the law, and to me, it's always been wrapped up in the inherent messianism within Christianity. So let's start there, because really what I wanted to talk to you about was false messiahs in Judaism. That was just, I think, a really interesting theoretical introduction. But talk to me about that. Talk to me about this, messianic impulse, obviously during the Second Temple, just to spell out for listeners. So Second Temple period goes from 6th century BCE to 1st century CE. There are a lot of people, especially in the later period, talking about, end of days and what happens in heaven. And these are all the books that don't quite make the cut in the Tanakh, right? The books that are right after. But then, obviously the first great, Messiah is Jesus. So talk to me a little bit about that. Where do you place, historical Jesus and Paul, not eventually what they become, within the sort of Jewish debate of mysticism?
Right. Well, I think you're right to suggest that that the Jesus movement eventually was the most successful messianic movement that emerged out of Jewish civilization, Jewish culture. Uh, I wouldn't say that Jesus of Nazareth and his immediate followers were the first messianic movement. I mean, I'm not a philologist of Near Eastern ancient texts, but my sense is that there are a number of texts already from the Second Temple period which foreshadow a number of the ideas that later become explicit in let's say fourth century properly speaking, Christian messianism, right? And perhaps even in some of the early ideas concerning Jesus that end up in the Gospels. Um, where would I place these folks? Well, that is to say, Jesus himself and his disciples, people like Paul. Um, a long time ago, I gave a presentation at a church, and the theme had nothing to do with Jesus, but I think my interlocutors or my audience was really anxious to hear what I thought about Jesus. So I told them, well, look, I mean, by all scholarly accounts, he was some sort of leader of an apocalyptic sect. It is by no means clear that he considers himself to be the Messiah, or that his followers considered him to be the Messiah. Although it's clearer that traditions that developed about him did assign to him a messianic role, and eventually led to his full-fledged deification. Um, Now, Paul is a very interesting figure in that he didn't know Jesus, but his writings, his letters, are perhaps the earliest surviving evidence of the impact of the Jesus movement um, in the in the uh, in the Levant. Uh, Paul presents himself as a Jew in good standing, but as somebody who essentially dissents from from what you might call mainstream Judean culture by embracing the idea that the life and the death of Jesus of Nazareth essentially changed the terms of history, right? So this is an echo. This contention is an echo of what is, I think, properly called messianism after the Second Temple falls, which is to say, a cluster of ideas that place a very, very strong emphasis on the life and the personality of the messianic figure. We started by talking a little bit about the messianic themes that are developed first in the Tanakh, in the Hebrew Bible. It is true that, in that sense, the culture that the Tanakh reveals is messianic, but you don't have anything like messianism in as much as you don't have a movement that is focused on an individual and presents that individual as a savior and redeemer. If you look, for example, at Yeshayahu, Yirmiyahu, all these prophets, what they posit is that essentially God is going to do the historical transformation at the end of time, and then he is going to install a Davidic monarch. You know, according to some rabbinic commentaries, this is not going to be anybody with superpowers or anything like that. He's going to be just a king who descends from the line of David, which makes me wonder to what degree are some of the prophetic texts that were written during or after the Babylonian exile, to what extent are they intended partly to bolster the authority of what remained of the Davidic royal family in Babylonia? That I don't know. It's a question for my colleagues who deal with the ancient Near East and its traditions. But regardless, I just want to make also, I don't know, by the way, Daniel, if that answers your question fully, but again, I would put Jesus, his disciples, and let's say the first generation of his followers into a kind of gray area between, let's say, mainstream Judean culture and the possibility of a non-Jewish messianist movement, which is inspired by events and personalities from Judea.
Tell
Um,
me if you
yeah,
think I'm connecting too many dots, unfairly. But you know, a lot of the messianic movements that we'll talk about soon, unsurprisingly come after some huge sociological change, usually for the worse, right? Some
yeah,
societal, collapse or downtroddenness or whatever. Oftentimes, at least if we're following these connections, messianism comes with sort of this antinomian, right? Anti-legal quality
yeah,
to it. It doesn't always have to be 100% opposed, but it's at least opposed to strict legalese. This is, not dissimilar, right? This makes total sense. Meaning, if society is functioning and working and it abides by some wider legal system, then leaders are going to say, hey, keep on following this law. It's only once things are sort of breaking down that you do start to get people that are saying, hey, this law that's been binding us, for whatever reason. We can think religiously, we could also think politically. I mean, I think,
yeah,
I don't want to talk about modern politics too much, but both forces on the right and the left today have sort of a political antinomianism, antinomian critique of, you see it when, in some countries populists take power and, don't care about, the judiciary or the constitution. And then on the flip side, you have, activists on the left that are even, applauding, let's say, extrajudicial killings of healthcare CEOs, because, well, the laws are unfair anyway. So, I think you have a lot of this in religion as well. So I think even, inherent to, and this is where, you'll tell me if I'm connecting too many dots, inherent to Paul and Jesus and what eventually became Christianity's critique of the law, it's because for them, if the Messianic era is here, then there's no more need for the law, right? The law in some sense, again, we can go back to Plato, but obviously, I don't know, early political theorists, right? In some sense, law is only there because humans are not perfect, right? If humans were perfect, this is the entire book, the Leviathan, right? If humans were perfect, you don't need law. And so if the Messiah has come and the Messiah is going to bring perfection, then, well, who needs to worry about, any type of law, whether it's
yeah,
religious law or civil law, ritual law, or anything like that. So that's more the criticism that I was talking about from Paul and Jesus. And then on the flip side, the rabbis who obviously rejected the Messianic era was here, and their way of sort of fixing this sociological mess of, Judaism in the late Second Temple period to post-destruction was to become, in some sense, hyper fixated on the law and saying, hey, the world is broken in some sense. I don't know if the rabbis in the Talmud were thinking this, but certainly later rabbinic formulations, the only way to fix the world is actually through very robust practice of the law. And so I don't know what you think of this connection.
So, the main connection you drew is between, let's say, societal and cultural crisis on one hand and messianism on the other. I think this connection is well attested to in history, right? When people feel that reality doesn't function as it should, then they seek some kind of redress. And if they're desperate, they seek some kind of escape from the norms that rule reality. And those norms may include a system of law. Now, so that connection is fair. What I would say is that it would be interesting to explore messianic movements that emerge when the surrounding society is more or less stable. I'm thinking particularly of the career of Menachem Mendel Schneerson as the Rebbe, the guiding light of the Chabad movement. Now, scholars of Hasidism may tell me that in fact there was a lot of crisis within Chabad, and that therefore, the followers bestowed upon Schneerson a messianic role. I don't know. But my sense is that there's something about the internal dynamics of a way of life and a way of thinking that may also lead to messianic speculation and messianic fervor without necessarily the surrounding historical, cultural, economic crisis.
What is interesting about Chabad, I was debating whether or not at the end of the podcast to go there, but I like the sort of jumping around.
Yeah,
It fits
sorry.
my no, it fits my way of thinking a lot more than sort of neatly lining this up.
Uh-huh.
And I'm just spitballing here, but Chabad is very legal centric, meaning,
Uh-huh.
in terms of mitzvah and ritual,
Yeah,
in a
yeah.
way that I think earlier either Hasidic leaders and or mystical, leaders would have been a little bit surprised at. Now, the one other thing, and then we'll get to medieval Spain here. You do have this tension because, at least as per Gershom Scholem and other scholars of Kabbalah, when they talk about why Kabbalah had such a staying power among Jews was because Kabbalah was actually able to explain Jewish law in a very captivating way that, other people had failed. So, Maimonides tried to give a defense as to why one should keep Jewish law. And essentially, Maimonides' defense basically falls short because if I find more spirituality taking a hike than I do, sitting in Shabbat morning services, according to some reading of Maimonides, he didn't say this, but, it's not a far leap to say, that actually might be better because that'll help you more on your quest for meditative truth and contemplation than, sitting in, synagogue all day. And so there had to be somebody who was going to defend, like, no, 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 here's why it's
Yeah.
important to do this, like, very specific legal thing
Yes.
as outlined by the Talmud. And that's what Kabbalah did. But, you even have this fight within Kabbalah of the more, messianics and, the more the
Right. Right.
legalists.
Yeah.
Um,
So in as much as the messianic motif is embedded in all of normative Jewish culture from, late antiquity onwards, um, any kind of Kabbalist would explain his or her, well, mostly his understanding of the value of observing the law in messianic terms at some level. You're right, though, that there are those who have, let's say, ants in their pants who don't wish to wait around, who think that the messianic explosion or transformation is around the corner, and those who focus more on a steadfast observance of law toward a glorious future in which the accumulation of good deeds, of mitzvot, of the mitzvot are not good deeds necessarily. I'm talking about the commandments, right? The observance of commandments is going to earn for the Jewish people their redemption, right? There's always that tension, but I think you make a very important point in identifying Kabbalah as a dynamic factor that allows not only ordinary Jews, but learned Jews to bridge the gap between messianism and legal performance, particularly in the 16th century, but even before that. Kabbalah essentially posits that there is a mystical significance, there are specific mystical effects to the performance of commandments, right? And that it falls to Jewish individuals to understand not only how to and what to do, right? But actually to understand the effects that their behaviors are going to have on the heavens, on the Godhead, on the and therefore on the progress of history and the march toward redemption. It's a deeply teleological understanding of life, which is already baked into the rabbinic conception of history. And by the way, it is true that that particularly after the fall of the of Bar Kokhba, of the conclusion of the second main Judean revolt against Rome, that rabbis try to tampen down messianic expectation and speculation because they fear it's going to lead to disaster. And they start, of course, to vilify, some of them at least, to vilify Bar Kokhba, not as a messiah, but as a false messiah, not as a courageous leader, but as a kind of awful, self-interested brigand or something like that. However, messianism doesn't disappear. The messianic impulse and the messianic motif is still there. And so what you see, for example, in the Talmud Yerushalmi is sustained meditation on how the messianic era is going to take place, right? And there is, as a result of that, a what I would call a rabbinic conception of history, which is anchored in the notion of progress toward the messianic future. So in that sense, yes, again, we can talk about divergences and legalism or rationalism versus mysticism, but there are ways in which they're always imbricated here and there. I mean, there's no way because look, this is one part of my objection to the term Judaism. Judaism is usually summoned as a term that is going to serve to analogize Jews and Christians or Jews and Muslims. Uh, Judean culture, Israelite culture is comprehensive. And so you're not going to have, I mean, first you can have your ultra rationalists, the people who speak in abstract terms about God, Maimonides you mentioned before, right? And then you can have people who want to mythologize not only God himself, to anthropomorphize God, but they're going to try to mythologize or to mythify, if you will, their relationship to the deity. So, and those two tendencies are never completely divorced.
I really like that. And, just two things to flag, and then we'll, I will,
Sure.
depart in long-awaited medieval Spain here. One, I was gonna, you mentioned Bar Kokhba, so just to flag for listeners, he of course was supported early on by a lot of the rabbis, especially Rabbi Akiva, who was,
Yes.
one of the de facto leaders of the Jewish community, supporting, Bar Kokhba's revolt against the Messiah, and Rabbi Akiva famously proclaimed him, a Messiah. So it's after that in some sense that you get this, this was, what, the year 137 or something, or 133 CE. And so that's when you get this very harsh clampdown on, Messiah and prophecy, especially once you go to Babylonia and have the Talmud there. So just wanted to flag that. The other thing that, let's just move to Spain because I think we'll be
Sure.
endlessly, staying there.
Yeah,
So
we could spend hours here. Yeah,
yeah, no,
absolutely.
we can spend, this. I don't know what your plan is the rest of the week, but we can. No, so Spain, you also have this, fascinating confluence of sociological factors. Maybe in the year 1000, at least from some scholarly conception, everything was, relatively good and picturesque and multicultural. Even though there's been a lot of, interesting scholarship. One of my favorite essays actually. There's a book by Mark Cohen, Under Cross and Crescent, and the entire first chapter is he writes about, the myth and counter myth. Right, the myth is that life was perfect for Jews under medieval Islamic rule, and this was mostly propagated by late 1800s Jewish scholars in Europe that were basically trying to, tell a Christian society, hey, 100 years after emancipation, Jews are still not equal in places like France and Germany. Look, even medieval Islamic world, who at that time in the 1800s in Europe were seen as, very backwards, look, they even treated us better. So you should for sure give us, better treatment. So there was a little bit of like mythical thinking there of saying, Judaism under Christianity terrible, Judaism under Islam good, and then that arose what Mark Cohen called the a strong counter myth of Jewish life under medieval Islam was actually the worst thing ever and might have been just as bad if not worse than Christianity, and that's obviously propagated by a lot of shall we say, right wing Zionist types who want to say, hey, the sort of anti Zionist critique, which has never really been true, but it is that, Jews in the Ottoman Empire or before, the West and Zionism, showed up. This was great and Jews were treated as equal and everything like that. And so this obviously arose, a strong counterpoint of saying not only were Jews not equal under, dhimmi status in the Islamic world, but Jews were, so not equal that this is terrible. Either way, that's a lengthy introduction to a point that has nothing to do with this. By the 13th century, you have all these forces that are sort of, again, messing up, normal peaceful rule, right? You have the Berber invasion from Africa into, southern Spain, making Jewish life uninhabitable, right? Already 100 years before that, Moses Maimonides, who we keep mentioning, actually had to, run away from Spain with his family, eventually landing in Cairo. So, Jewish life under Islamic controlled Spain effectively ended. Then you had from the top the Reconquista, right? So, had this constant, war breaking out. And, not to mention, this whole period was full of the translation of Greek texts and trying to figure out, where does Judaism fit into Aristotle and Plato? And then you had, Christian conceptions of the Trinity. And, so all of this, ended up arising some very interesting Jewish intellectual movements, one of which is early Kabbalah. And so I want to land on, a figure that there isn't much written about him. Every time I try to find more information about him, I always find, land on the same, two or three articles. But somebody named Abraham Abulafia, can you just sort of introduce him? Who is Abulafia? And then we can sort of tell the great
Yeah.
story about him.
Okay, so perhaps a good way to introduce Abu Lafia is to talk about the genesis of Kabbalah itself. So Kabbalah developed as a kind of uh, as a hermeneutic slash mystical discipline among Jewish scholars in Provence, which is a very beautiful area between present day Catalonia, Crown of Aragon, and well, what used to be the crown. Well, it still is the Crown of Aragon. It's Spain and France, right? And this was a crossroads of various cultural influences, some from the north, including Ashkenazi pietism, Ashkenazi mysticism, and from the south, various philosophical streams, including Aristotelianism, Platonism, particularly in the form of Neoplatonism, etc. So from Provence, which generated the first main Kabbalistic text, the Sefer HaBahir, which introduced a lot of the main concepts of Kabbalah. From Provence, Kabbalah developed further south among the students of the Provençal teachers in the Crown of Aragon and in Castile. Abulafia was a somewhat sui generis or one of a kind Kabbalist who, if I'm not mistaken, lived in Saragossa or the region of Navarre. And he developed what the scholar Moshe Idel calls an ecstatic form or school, mini school of Kabbalah, which is to say that unlike his predecessors in Provence and his, let's say, more mainstream counterparts in Castile and Aragon, Abulafia sought a somewhat less rational encounter with the power, the divine creative power of the Hebrew language. In his works and his letters and the echoes that his ideas left among his students, we see that he was a man who sought very consciously to accomplish trances, right? Physical situations in which the conventional, let's say, perceptions and order of reality fall away, and the devotee is face to face, as it were, with the sheer power, the glory, uh, the um, the radiance of the divine. Now, Abulafia wasn't a pure irrationalist. I mean, like many other Kabbalists, he did undertake calculations about the end of time, about the onset of the Messianic era. And among other things, it is, I don't want to say surmise because it is really surmise, but some who have tried to reconstruct his life, point out that he calculated the exact year of redemption, and at one point or another may well have considered himself to be the Messiah, and thus went or attempted to go to Rome, where he anticipated being able to somehow confront the Pope and overthrow the Pope as the earthly representative of some sort of, evil power, right? So the Messiah stands for the power of God on earth. The Pope is sort of like the I don't know, the poster child of evil, right? I don't remember, but I don't think that Abulafia was ever able to meet the Pope, and he died relatively young, and so what we have uh, by way of his let's say his inheritance is an approach to Kabbalah which prizes experience in many ways, um, experience that transcends or defies intellectual perception, cognition, right? As distinct from the more traditional midrashic style of Kabbalah, which is developed in Castile and then flows eastward and southward toward Italy. Eastward toward the rest of the Mediterranean, southward toward the Italian peninsula. And
Yeah,
actually,
and Abula
west eastward as well to the Italian peninsula, but southward in general.
Yeah, and Abulafia seems to start, yes, he was sort of, one of a kind. His movement basically fizzled out after him, but he does kind of start this wider trend that would take place among a lot of, Sephardic Jews specifically, especially after the, expulsion from Spain, which happens a couple hundred years later, of, sort of, overt messianism, either within some wider philosophy about Judaism, like Isaac Luria in Tzfat, or, hey, maybe I'm the Messiah and maybe I'm actually here to redeem everybody. Abulafia, from what I've been able to read, was also a bit of an antinomian, right? Like, so at some point he was also, doing all these things such as, for some reason it's always orgies. I don't know why. It's the same thing
Oh,
with Shabtai Tzvi
that
and
I've never
Jacob
read about.
Frank.
Yeah.
Whenever I read an article about, Jacob Frank or Shabtai Tzvi, I don't know if this is just,
Well,
in some
Frank and Tzvi, yes. I don't know that Abulafia is connected to any sexual antinomianism per se, but okay, go on.
so maybe I'm thinking, but I'm pretty sure in some articles, again, listeners can easily fact check, but again, this idea of like, not only is Jewish law, you know not the be all end all, but actually there's something in Jewish law that's restricting you from reaching your full spiritual
Yeah.
potential, which I find really interesting.
It is really interesting, and I would say the following, that unlike, for example, the Safedian school or schools, if you will, Abulafia doesn't seem to me, I could be wrong, but it doesn't seem to me to have bequeathed a very highly developed theosophy, a mystical philosophy, but rather a style, an approach to a mystical experience. Now, um, it's probably the case that um, that antinomianism filtered its way to into Kabbalah, or became manifest in Kabbalah even before the infamous cases of Shabtai Tzvi and Jacob Frank. But I would caution that that antinomianism isn't necessarily characteristic of Kabbalah proper. In other words, it is something that no, let me rephrase that. Okay, it is, in as much as antinomianism uh, becomes part of a Kabbalistic, let's say, way of life or a Kabbalistic philosophy or a Kabbalistic, movement. It is also connected to an understanding of law. So just to give you an example, which is not perfect, but follow me for a second. The Hasidei Ashkenaz, the medieval mystics of Central Europe, posited that there was a law of heaven, din shamayim or din hashamayim, above and beyond the mere law that they were studying and in which they were experts, which was, basically a traditional or conventional legal study through the Talmud and so forth. In other words, it is not that their departure from law somehow renounced law altogether. That was Jacob Frank, right? I mean, he even encouraged his followers to convert to Christianity, right? The Hasidei Ashkenaz saw a deeper level of understanding of law that would bring them, the specially initiated, those with a special spiritual touch, into contact with God. By the same token, I would hazard, I don't know, but I think that Abulafia was very much concerned with law. But inasmuch as he read the letters of the law in normative texts, he expected those letters to contain an otherworldly power. He wanted to unpack the power of the characters, the creative power by which, according to a traditional Jewish understanding, not just a Kabbalistic understanding, God created everything. And perhaps it's worth taking a second to explain this. In a traditional understanding, the Hebrew language is not semantic, right? It is the very means, the very stuff of divine creation. Why? Because, as we read in Bereshit, in Genesis, God speaks and reality is thereby generated, right? So this was an old theme in Jewish esotericism, not Kabbalah necessarily, but esotericism, that then was inherited by the Kabbalists in the Middle Ages. And so if we consider that law is something that is written down, that is explicated in Hebrew characters, we can't really divorce it, not entirely, right, from the mystical experiences of the Jewish mystics. Again, that's why I pointed earlier to the example, the counterexample of St. Francis of Assisi. St. Francis was going out, and according to his followers, he was going out into the, the fields or whatever surrounding his town, and he was, getting stigmata, and he was talking to birds and talking to bushes, and, in other words, unmediated contact with the divine. Fine. Even Abulafia, who you might say was completely beyond law and completely, sort of wacky and so forth, even he was starting from the point of view that his main job was to look at a piece of text that was going to explain to him what the law was and how to apply it. And then as an advanced student, his job was also to unpack the divine power of the letters so they would flood his consciousness and lead him to whatever behavior he thought or he not thought, but he perceived was worthwhile. In
I
that
always had
sense,
this internal debate. Sorry, you're just
yeah.
reminding me of this, interesting debate that I've oftentimes had with myself. Listeners can know what I think about oftentimes. You know, did medieval Kabbalists like Abulafia, and I'm curious to get your take on this, did they have so much respect for the Torah that they thought because there's infinite meaning, any type of creative interpretation they can make out of it was valid? Or did they actually have almost little respect? That's probably not the right word, but almost like, a dismissive sort of
Yeah, that they
approach where
want to
they
overthrow the
yeah,
Torah.
where they almost
Yeah,
needed to view it as
yeah,
like, just complete raw
yeah,
material, right? Because like you also have this debate, with constitutional scholars, right? You have on one side, the strict constitutionalists or originalists that are like, what did the founders mean? What does this text say? What's the strict legal interpretation? And then all the way on the other side, you have this, no, we can, interpret whatever. And usually, at least the conservative criticism, who knows if this is true or not, is that, more progressive interpreters of the Constitution just just simply value the Constitution less. And so I oftentimes think about this from the Kabbalists, because you also have
Yeah,
later Kabbalists, Gershom Scholem documents this, 14th, 15th, 16th century, there's some Kabbalistic teachings that the Torah that we have now is actually not the real Torah, it's some corrupted version, and that, when Mashiach, when the Messiah comes, we'll actually have the real text, and the letters will be ordered differently because, one of the big problems of, at least some Jewish messianism is, if the Torah is eternal and the Torah deals with law, if the Messiah comes and the Messiah basically abolishes the need for law, right? You have cases in the Torah dealing with, murder and dealing with spiritual, ritual
yeah,
impurity. And so what need is there for, I don't know, 500 verses about
right,
ritual impurity if the Messiah is here and everybody's pure? So one such Kabbalistic answer is, you're right, the Torah is actually going to, reconfigure its words, and it's going to be, pure unadulterated truth, as opposed
okay.
to what the Kabbalists basically nod to as sort of like the necessary truth of the Torah now. So I don't know. I'm curious when you think
Yeah,
about
yeah, yeah.
this. Is this
So it's a very good question, right? And you frame it in terms of the, let's say, the interpreters of Torah writ large, right? Do they really respect the Torah, or do they, in a sense, reveal a desire to throw it aside and to abrogate it, uh, for abrogation for its own sake? Okay, so I would frame the question somewhat differently. I would say that Torah is such a foundational a part of the civilization of all Jewish mystics that they cannot but speak in terms of Torah. In other words, even somebody like Shabtai Tzvi, whom I suppose we will spend some time on, uh, was making the argument, or if he wasn't, then certainly his main spin doctor, Nathan of Gaza, was making the argument that it was necessary to reveal a new face of the Torah. In other words, to fulfill the Torah, but to do it according to the proper interpretation that had been revealed upon the advent of Shabtai Tzvi as a revealed Messiah. So there wasn't a complete reversal of Torah, but there was a kind of revaluation, or a transvaluation of Torah, right? Now, when you get to somebody like who's by all apocryphal and less apocryphal accounts more radical than Shabtai Tzvi himself, Jacob Frank, then you might see something that's much more, let's say, conceivable in terms of our understanding of human pathology, right? You just destroy for its own sake. But let's keep in mind that even somebody like Jacob Frank was part and parcel of a way of thinking about halacha that Gershom Scholem, among others, identifies with two important principles. Number one, a tremendous ambivalence. Yeah. The observant human being, the one who has been kept on the straight and narrow all his or her life by this normative system of values and of practices. Yes. At some level feels crushed by its weight, particularly when reality does not ratify the value, reality around the law does not ratify the value of the law. And certainly does not lead to immediate, redress of grievances and so forth. It's value number one. Another principle, this is the notion of fulfilling a commandment through its abrogation. What's sometimes translated or mistranslated as redemption through sin. Something like hamitzvah haba'a derech avera. I don't remember what the proper Hebrew phrase is, but it's the notion that even the person who is dead set on imposing an antinomian version of the law is still referring to the law, is still working within a framework of law. This is, again, absolutely fundamental. And I don't mean to be an essentialist, but this is fundamental to Jewish civilization, at least as of the Second Temple period. I would say even the end of the First Temple period.
I mean, another way of saying
Yeah.
what you're saying
Mhm.
is the reason why, take civil disobedience, right? The
Yes.
reason why acts like, I don't know, say, pick the most famous example, Rosa Parks, right? Like, so obviously Rosa Parks was breaking the law, right? And that was the whole point. But you could only understand how powerful that is within a framework of the law. Meaning, like, if you
Correct.
take, I don't know, a 12-year-old who has never heard of, I don't know, the civil rights and Jim Crow and everything like that, and you just tell them, like, hey, this woman, Rosa Parks, like, sat in a seat she shouldn't on the bus, you're just, who cares,
Yeah,
right? But
yeah.
it's only within the framework of American law that that act becomes important. So, yeah, I think that is a very interesting point with Shabtai Tzvi and also Jacob Frank.
That's a very good analogy, Rosa Parks versus, I don't know, what's the name of that guy, the Helter Skelter guy, who's absolutely insane, who murdered some people. He's in jail or died. I don't remember. No, the murderer of the wife of a famous Polish Jewish filmmaker. Darn it, what's his name? Uh, anyway, uh, I'm talking about a nihilist, a completely insane nihilist, right? So in the era of the civil rights struggle and so forth, and the let's say the feminist revolution and people-based movements in the United States, there was always a spectrum, right? From those who wanted to essentially affirm the value of the United States as a cultural and legal system, like Rosa Parks and MLK and so forth, and those who wanted to destroy it. Yeah, from the Nation of Islam to I don't know, to what's his name? Darn it! I'm so sorry. I think I have his face in front of me. Big hairy guy with a huge beard, carved a swastika onto his forehead. No. Ah, okay,
Charles
never.
Manson?
Charles Manson. There we go. Charles Manson as sort of the crazy extreme without any kind of ideology other than a kind of nihilistic, destructive and self-destructive impulse, right? I mean, I think it is true that messianists, or excuse me, mystics in particular, because they're seeking some kind of emotional stimulus, are going to fall somewhere within that spectrum. That is true.
It's really interesting. Okay, so let's just get to, do a little bit of a deep dive
Sure.
into Shabtai Tzvi and Jacob Frank. Then, I know you have a class coming up, so I don't want to keep you forever. You
Fine.
know, let's unpack. You mentioned a little bit, surrounding Shabtai Tzvi, just for listeners. 17th century, Ottoman Jew, probably of Sephardic descent, although that is sort of a little bit debated. And again,
Yeah, the way I teach it is that he was probably of part Romaniot descent.
oh,
In other
interesting.
words,
Okay.
he was yeah, probably part Sephardi as well, but his family was very anchored in the older strata of Jewish communities of Asia Minor. They were from Izmir.
Got it. So he, obviously a very, very well thought out Jewish scholar. I mean, again, I really like your point before between the nihilists and the non-nihilists, because part of what makes a Shabtai Tzvi isn't just the, Yerida L'tzorech Aliyah, right? It's another way of saying, going down for the sake of going up, or what you were saying
Yes.
before, breaking the world in order to repair it or whatever. You only get a Shabtai Tzvi if he gains the respect of everybody and then does that, right? So you can't, I don't know, graduate high school and then decide you're going to do that because everybody will just laugh you out of the room. But Shabtai Tzvi, starts getting a little bit more and more daring. And if Abulafia, I don't remember if Abulafia ever explicitly engaged in sexual acts for the sake of spirituality. Shabtai Tzvi definitely did. You know, I guess before even going to anything specific about Shabtai Tzvi, some question that Gershom Shalom talks about this a little bit, but within mysticism and, even bringing back in pagan elements, which, obviously, Judaism tried very hard to push out all of the pagan elements, that existed in ancient Canaan. So this idea of the Asherah and the Baal and temple prostitutes and whatever, very strict monotheism that, of course, the sort of pagan elements were always sort of bubbling up. And in the Zohar, they sort of, come back to life a little bit. One of the parts of, a lot of these, pagan practices that you see in like ancient Greece was sex being a ritualistic act of, the same way that, if you meditate for 10 hours and the same way if you take drugs, right? Just getting yourself into alternative mental states. Is this connected at all? Meaning, the rabbis obviously, I mean, the rabbis weren't prudes the same way that, say early Christians were, but sex to them was never, right? Sex was always to some extent just not just for procreation but 90% for procreation, and then even you have Maimonides who was to some extent even anti-sex a little bit, and then you have on the flip side Shabtai Tzvi, who's now actually engaging, with sexual acts for the sake of spirituality. I mean, is this connected at all?
It's a very good question. Let me just draw a parenthesis regarding Shabtai Tzvi. Perhaps I'm underinformed. I don't know, but I have not encountered many um, or much evidence that Shabtai Tzvi himself was engaged in sexual transgressions. I can tell you that sexual transgression was attributed to him, and then his followers tried to explain it in mystical terms. The fact, for example, that I think he had 4 wives, and if I'm not mistaken, he may have only consummated one of those marriages. So this, of course, was in normative rabbinic terms, this was very odd, uh, and suggestive of a kind of sexual dysfunction or perhaps even transgression. Um, I have it is also the case that some of Shabtai Tzvi's followers did violate conventional norms of treatment between the sexes and so forth. Um, but again, I may be wrong, but it is only with the Sabbateans who emerged after the conversion and the death of Shabtai Tzvi that you see a din of claims regarding sexual impropriety, which of course culminate with the Frankist heresy, right? And there, I think we have some credible evidence that there was sexual impropriety. And by sexual impropriety, I don't mean necessarily things like incest and so forth, but simply sex among people who are not married. Yes, and I would argue that rabbinic Judaism does not value sex between partners in a marriage, mostly for procreation. Look, you're the rabbi, so you can correct me, but I think that there's a lot of discussion of sex as a sanctifying act that is intended to cause the partners to experience pleasure, but in this case, illicit pleasure, right? But to your question, right, is there some, I don't know, connection between the desire to transgress sexual norms and messianic, effervescence? Um, Obviously, nothing that I say is Torah from Sinai, but I think that there has to be some kind of connection for the simple reason that a mystic is looking for avenues to God that are not conventional, right? That are not, let's say, in the Beit Midrash, that are not purely intellectual, that are not purely, let's say, practical. How do you kosher an oven? Okay, that's a very practical question of law. And granted, it may edify those who study and those who apply that particular, norm and certainly rules that are strictly procedural are intended to sanctify reality and ultimately to bring about the redemption of the Jewish people. But within the mystical ken, I think we have a temperamental difference, right? The need for, if you'll pardon the modern reference, for Moshiach now, a kind of impatience with the usual channels, which may very logically lead to a violation, to again, a transvaluation of norms, including sexual norms.
It also, I mean,
Yeah.
the act of procreation. I mean, your point is totally granted. I think you are right. I think there also is a tension within rabbinic literature about is sex just for the tool of procreation or for some sort of ona'ah or pleasure, as the rabbis call it. It's sort of probably the answer to all good rabbinic questions is yes to both
Yes,
sides.
yes.
Um,
Right, right,
but I think also because obviously Kabbalah, early Kabbalah also talks a lot about sex in a way that
right.
rabbinic Judaism was off
Correct,
limits, and it's
correct.
because it sort of is,
Good point. I wanted to refer to that. Go ahead.
yeah,
Yeah,
it sort of is the most godly like act a human can do. Meaning, I mean, you are kind of creating life, with the procreative act, and especially before you really understand how that works on a cellular level. I mean, it really does seem like this. divine-like act that you're able to do. And so, you get, tons of literature in the Zohar and other contemporary Kabbalistic works talking about all the, highest of highs in terms of holiness, and then also in terms of the lowliest of lows, where, even I don't know, I work on a campus, obviously, when students are trying to be funny, they'll, fire all sorts of questions at me. And, one of the questions that, always elicits whenever I do, an Ask Me Anything or Ask the Rabbi event on campus, you know, inevitably somebody will say, well, what does Judaism think about, masturbation and wasting seed? And, it's interesting because there's virtually nothing, in the rabbinic literature. There's one story of, in Genesis of, two husbands who refuse to procreate with their wife. So maybe that's an anti-masturbation story, but probably not. That's probably because they actually fulfilled their obligation to their dead brother to actually, do what's called yibum and levirate marriage. But it's not until Kabbalah where you start to get all this literature that now, I don't know, you walk through the streets of
Yeah.
Jerusalem and people are handing you all these pamphlets of, the
Sure.
"You shall be holy" pamphlets, if you know, you know. Um, and that's when you start getting these like really strict, anti, sex and all these things. So I think there is an interesting connection there.
Yeah, I agree. The sort of the dialogue between sexual self-limitation or societally conditioned limitation and the desire for expression, right? That dyad is always very powerful in particularly in Kabbalah. And you put your, as usual, you put your hand your hand or your finger on something very important, which is the evocative power of the language of procreation as the most godlike function that human beings actually fulfill. Yes. In various ancient cultures and therefore medieval cultures, there is a great deal of concern about life bestowing liquids. Yeah, sweat, semen, blood, etc., etc. So the questions that are posed to you about masturbation are particular, are unique to the historical moment. But I mean, I think they can shed light on something which is a lot broader, which is the idea that humanity is life and God has bestowed life upon humanity, and that relationship is absolutely central. So when the Kabbalists start to try to translate very cold, abstract Neoplatonic concepts into a comprehensive view of the transcendent, they start to use the language of sex to explain the relationship between, let's say, the sephirot, the various potencies, or I don't want to say qualities, they're not mere qualities, but the personality traits of God, as it were, right? Oh, of course, the relationships between spiritual forces. The idea, or one of the most important mystical goals in all Jewish practice has been for many centuries devekut, right? The idea of coming close, of cleaving to God in a, if you will, a kind of a sexual like union, as distinct from communion, which means that the human being is sort of completely effaced in the totality of divinity. There's also the notion of yichudim, right? Of the conscious and purposeful uniting of spiritual essences, uh, an effect that is supposed to bring not only sort of conventional sanctification, but is supposed to repair the innermost workings of the divine of the divine abode. So all of this is highly sexualized. It is therefore very evocative, and it taps precisely into that dyad that you identified between the need to be chaste, to be demure, to be tsanua, modest, and to revel, to not only to acknowledge, but to revel in the creative power of life. Yes, the creative power that God has, in essence, allowed us to share. And here we're not just talking about sexual procreation, we're talking about the creative power of letters. Think of it. When you're a yeshiva bocher, which I've never been, by the way, um, and you're sitting there studying the texts, you are imbibing centuries upon centuries of intellectual and very emotionally charged interpretations of of an inheritance that is supposed to have been given at Mount Sinai, right? So this is an incredibly powerful moment. And so you are, in a sense, playing with the very substance. Again, Hebrew as a non-semantic language, you're playing with the very substance of creation. And that's where you get things like, I don't know, the idea that a Kabbalist in proper standing can create a golem, a kind of uh, 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 an almost human being who only lacks one quality of the human soul, right? And in that sense, a human being can be God-like in creating an animate being.
Yeah, and meanwhile, to not to focus too much on this dichotomy, but I am sort of in my head at least liking it more and more. The rabbis. There's a famous story. Now that I have a 5-week old, I'm thinking about parenting a lot. So there's a famous story in the Talmud where a man is very poor, and for whatever reason his wife isn't there, and so he can't feed his baby, and so the Talmud said a miracle occurs and he actually grows breasts and starts to be able to feed his child. And one rabbi is there saying, wow, how holy is this man that nature was changed for him. And then a bigger rabbi says, no, 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 how terrible is this man that nature had to be changed for him, right? Almost saying that, like,
Mhm.
the miraculous nature of some Jewish leaders is actually not a depiction of their holiness. It's actually like,
Yeah,
whoa, how terrible is this, that
yeah,
the,
yeah.
the natural world. So I think that it goes directly at contrapose. I will also just flag for people listening. I talked to Daniel Matt, who is one of the de facto scholar, experts in the Zohar, the expert, and we talked the entire time about this idea of the Shekhinah in the Zohar, which, of course, in the Zohar's, entire theological view, to some extent, God in some sense is broken, and one of the flowery metaphors that the Zohar gives for this is sort of the male aspect of God is estranged from the female aspect of God, and they need to be reunited. So the
Yes.
whole thing is sort of dancing around this metaphor. And again, we obviously have this. I mean, the most famous example is Shir Hashirim, or Song of Songs, which is a very erotic like poetry that has been interpreted to be, the Jewish people and God, but nothing like you get in medieval Kabbalah there.
Yeah, no, absolutely. We started by referring partly to the evocative power of certain kinds of poetry. Back to Jesus, right? So why is the story of Jesus so powerful? Forget about the actual Jesus, the historical Jesus. We don't know who he was, and really, we don't really agree on what he said or didn't say. But we know that the story of his life and death has become one of the most powerful, most appealing stories in human history, right? Why is that? Well, partly because of the conception of the deity having some sort of human frailty, yeah, becoming, as it were, human through incarnation or what have you. This kind of mythologizing of the divine is at play in Kabbalah, is in fact central to Kabbalah. This is something that Sholem emphasizes again and again, right? Kabbalah remythologizes, introduces mythos into a system that might otherwise have turned sharply toward a purely philosophical conception, particularly among the scholars in Spain. Um, Maimonides has been accused of, in a sense, if not relativizing, then certainly making abstract some of the more evocative aspects of the Jewish canonical traditions, right? For him, the anthropomorphizing of God is for for people who don't understand, for ordinary folks. It's not for people who truly understand that the God of Israel is really the God of philosophy, yeah, properly understood. Um, so I think Kabbalah has legs precisely because of that tendency to humanize the divine. Yeah, the very image of the Shekhinah as a sort of as a forlorn maiden who's on, who's fallen to the ground and is all dusty and requires some sort of help is very, let's say, appealing to a medieval imagination that is already informed not only by Jewish older Jewish narratives, but by chivalric romances. God is the ultimate redeemer of the maiden. As the Prince Charming with a capital P. So this is very important. We are unlike, let's say, I don't know, other mammals, we are meaning generating creatures. And the way that we generate meaning is through stories. Philosophy needs stories to appeal to more than the philosophers. And I think this is what's happening with Kabbalah from the 12th century onward.
So we've been talking for a while. I know we had planned to talk a lot more about Jacob Frank or potentially even later, Hasidic
Yeah,
movements.
yeah.
I mean, what else, have we not discussed that you think is interesting and important? The three different ways I was thinking to steer this conversation, and then you can sort of take your pick. Is you obviously have Jacob Frank and Frankism. Then you have early Hasidism and people like obviously the Baal Shem Tov, but Rabbi Nachman of Breslov, who at times dabbled in a lot of this, and then not to really create. I don't really know how to place this within our mystical tradition, but at least in terms of the anti-legal tradition, you have the early, you have the Haskalah, the early Reform movement that were extremely anti-messianic and mystical, but were also antinomian for all sorts
Yeah.
of different reasons. And I think it connects in some way. But I'll throw that all to you.
Sure. So, I mean, we can pick up any of the threads that you've laid out. I mean, one thing that occurred to me as I was thinking about what to say this morning is that a very interesting sort of sub-theme in Jewish messianism is the idea of a Messiah who is not the son of David, not the descendant of David, rather the descendant of Joseph via Joseph's son Ephraim, right? And this has a very interesting story. I think this particular motif allows a number of mystics to claim that role, so as perhaps not to be held to an impossibly high standard that they're going to redeem all of reality. But somebody like I don't know, Shlomo Molcho, whom we haven't mentioned, or Avraham Cardoso, yeah, or who knows, maybe even some of the Hasidic masters may have toyed with the idea that they are Messiah, son of Ephraim, and this gives them a certain credibility. At the same time, again, it doesn't commit them to being the ultimate, let's say, heroes of history. Now, one thing that occurs to me is given your last comment about a modern world in which secularity is dominant, is the following. I think it is possible to trace messianism across, let's say, the traditional stages of Jewish cultural, creation, uh, and through and beyond the Enlightenment. Okay, now I can't, I'm not inclined to think of Haskalah, the movement for Jewish enlightenment, as a messianic movement, but I do see that the messianic germ is there throughout various strands of modern Jewish thinking and practice. Just to give you two prominent examples, the Marxian conception of history is flat out messianic. It is highly teleological. What does Marx argue? That history goes through a series of necessary stages. And at the end stage, the final stage of history, is the stage of complete redemption and justice on earth and full human equality, where some of the let's say some of the norms of civilization are broken and reconfigured. For example, the family doesn't function the same way. The economy doesn't function the same way. There are no more peoples, no more ethnic groups. There are no more religions. People basically share goods and services and they're all happy. It's a messianic vision. Okay, that's number one. Number two is Zionism, which Arthur Hertzberg, among others, calls secularized messianism, right? Think of the degree to which Zionism, modern secular Zionism, political Zionism, as well as practical Zionism, draw on the motifs that are already articulated in the Tanakh regarding a glorious future. Now, if you asked, the early kibbutzniks of the 1880s to 1920s, are you trying to have God sort of deliver the third temple from the heavens? They would say, of course not. Are you crazy? But many of them might argue, well, in fact, we, the Jewish people, are our own messiahs, or we can bring about our own redemption. This is, I think, most famously articulated in the writing and practice of A.D. Gordon, right? The idea that to the extent that that diaspora Jews not only work on the land but actually get their fingers in the land, that they are redeemed through the sweat of their brow, through the project of upbuilding the nation and its physical structure. The same applies to Rabbi Kook, right? Somebody who was in a sense a kind of a religious counterpart of A.D. Gordon, who thought in messianic terms about a transitional stage wherein the secular Jews were going to help bring about the full redemption that would, of course, result in a very orthodox, very orthodox outcome, according to him. Everybody will observe halacha, etc.,
Although
etc.
what is interesting,
Yeah.
according to Rav Kook, of course, just for listeners, the first chief rabbi of Israel, is he actually was willing, not in any major cases, but in ways that I think are very interesting, willing to abrogate Jewish law to
Yes.
fulfill that messianic goal, right? So the most famous, that still is an often debate in Israel is, Shemitah, which, you're not supposed to, you work the land every 7 years, right? As per
Right.
the
Right.
the Torah, and this is of course disastrous for an economy because Israel, especially in the early days, right? British Mandate Palestine, 1920s, 30s was sort of like the world exporter in oranges and other, this was like the entire economy. And, you had the more Haredi types basically saying, no, you got to stop every 7 years. And he comes up with this, halachic loophole of basically saying, no, 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 you just sell the land, sell the land the same way we sell the chametz, right? Wink, wink, whatever. And then, you basically don't have to worry about this law that if you read texts in the Tanakh and the Talmud about Shemitah is seen as like one of the most important things, like the Talmud says exile only happens when the Jews are not following Shemitah. So, from some perspective, you're like, well, if you're actually religious in some, Jewish legal sense, you should be, begging people not to work the land every 7 years. But if you're not, I don't know. To me, Shemitah has always been this fascinating case of, religious Zionism's complicated relationship with, again, the institutional Jewish law, because Zionism is sort of this radical movement, whether religious Zionism or secular Zionism.
Yeah. No, I look, you're a fountainhead of ideas, but it's very interesting how throughout our whatever hour and a half of speaking, you have actually created order in the discussion by essentially positing this interesting tension, this relationship between the structural or the structured, I should say, and the radical formless, the aspect that pushes forward, that pushes the boundaries and may even destroy certain boundaries in order to achieve particular ends, right? I mean, this is a key of culture, right? Culture being a collective venture, and therefore, something that has to be intelligible to more than one person, right? I can't just invent, oh, I guess I could invent my own culture, but then I would be completely unintelligible to everybody else. And on the other hand, culture is something that is fundamentally a platform for creativity and for change and for a breaking of rules and boundaries, right? Again, we've discussed the dialogic nature of rules and their breaking of rules, and I think that's inherent, particularly in mysticism and in messianism. Why? Because again, mysticism is about seeking a relatively unconventional experience that is very powerful and that allows for knowledge that is not strictly communicable in conventional language, at least not in conventional language. And messianism is, of course, is or may be viewed as the application of that approach to questions of social change. How do we get out of this mess? How do we get in this mess? Who's going to lead us out of this mess? What does the future hold? Is life worth living? Because life sucks, right? These are the questions that Messianism is intended to address, and they are very much within the structure of an old, multi-millennial system of thinking and doing, which is again remarkable. It's deeply paradoxical.
Maybe this is, hopping too much to, lofty conclusions, just to attempt to land this.
Mhm.
I wasn't planning on saying this, but I'm thinking about this a lot. There's obviously a crisis of meaning for a lot of people now, especially, not especially Jews are, of course, counted within normal people. So a lot of young Jews have a crisis for meaning. And so as people start to learn about Judaism, the sort of, if you're coming at Judaism from a knowledgeable or a non-practicing perspective, Jewish law just seems so daunting that, you're like, okay, well, that's not for me. I just want to tap into the more spiritual aspects of Judaism, which is all the stuff that we're talking about. But it does present this interesting paradox because, in some sense, what you're saying and what we've been saying is that the spiritual elements of Judaism come from the framework of law within the creative breaking of that law, right? It's like, what's that famous line where, you got to learn the rules as an artist before you break it. It's almost to tap into the creativity. Not that you have to be, some Haredi practicing the law, but like you need some understanding, at least in my feeling, of both the intellectual history and a little bit of like what it feels like to engage in, traditional Jewish life before then you go and
Oh,
reach your spirituality through the
no, no,
breaking of it.
absolutely. Look, I mean, on one level, you're talking about something very straightforward, which is you cannot engage or disengage from something that you really don't know, right? So study first and then decide, well, I'll take this, I won't take that. That's on a very simple, straightforward level. But you also point to something much more significant, right? In as much as somebody wishes to, let's say, to cut through all the legalistic BS and get right down to the spirit, I mean, that somebody is not really getting I would put it this way, that somebody is thinking in fundamentally dualistic and I dare say Christian terms. Jewish civilization does not distinguish sharply and does not posit an ultimate conflict, a tension between between the world and the spirit, between the body and the spirit, between Jesus and Caesar or whatever. I mean, traditional Jewish culture is a comprehensive way of life, right? Hence the partial emphasis of law. But by the way, the only way to get at the creative wellsprings of Jewish life is not necessarily or are not necessarily to break the law, right? That's not what I was trying to say. In Messianism and in mysticism, there is that possibility. But if you, for example, come at Jewish life from a position of relative ignorance or disengagement or even estrangement, right? And you wish to know, then I think it behooves you to understand that there's no either or here, right? You study the law creatively in order to apply it creatively. In essence, you are owning your the means that your ancestors or the ancestors of the Jews today have given posterity to make their culture what they will. Yeah, it's not a matter of either you break the law or you get rid of the law and you get to the really sort of cool deep stuff, or you're stuck in some sort of I don't know, like an old trigonometry class, like just a bunch of equations, and the outcome is, oh, a kosher oven or a glatt kosher restaurant. That's not the way it works. Again, there's a dialogue, there's a very important relationship between um, between the world and the transcendent that I think traditional Jewish culture is always grappling with, and even non-traditional Jewish culture. But I think as we move toward the 19th and 20th centuries, a lot of Jewish traditions have been, let's say, colonized, to use a very loaded term, colonized by Christian understandings. Hence, for example, the use of the term Judaism, which, by the way, is not present either in the Tanakh nor in the rabbinic canon. Uh, Sometimes I refer to the rabbinic phrase "life of Torah" to define this way of life, but the fact is that it has no name, no singular name, to be sure, because it is understood to be part and parcel of life. It's
Exactly, right.
not.
You have this, the bad, now I can start telling dad jokes, right? So,
Yeah, now you have license, yes.
exactly. I have a license. I'm officially, I've been doing it for years, but now now I can tell people I do it instead of just whispering it. You have the old fish talking to the young fish, and the old fish is like, how's the water? And the young fish is like, what the hell is water? Right. So in some sense, that's what you're describing about
Right,
Judaism, right? Like we've
right.
never had to define it because it just was, but it's only when it comes into interaction with secularity or other cultures that it's like, okay, well, what is this thing that we're doing and how do you separate it? The other interesting thing, you kind of talked about, a non-traditional Jewish life, but it connects back to the point you were making before because non-traditional Jewish life, they're still very engaged in Judaism through either progressive socialist movements or Zionism is an attempt to almost have that sort of spiritual surgeons through something else that's loosely connected to Judaism, right? So, the idea of tikkun olam in progressive Judaism has in many ways, oh, you don't need to worry about whether or not your oven is kosher or not because of our job is tikkun olam, the sort of grandiose fixing the world through social justice, or in the Zionistic case, right, you don't need to worry about prayer and that God stuff anymore, at least in, secular labor Zionism, because we are working the land and we are quite literally doing it. And that is in distinction. Obviously, it's not, you have every person, across the spectrum, but that's, you know, in distinction to those people sitting there saying like, no, the law is still, super important in all aspects. And this is, I guess just full circle, I grew up reading, Rav Soloveitchik's Halachic Man, where there he almost goes to like the nth degree of saying, just for to describe for listeners, one of the more well-known passages, and this is Joseph Soloveitchik. He's saying, when he is there and he sees the sun setting, while many people see a beautiful sunset and nature, and what the psalmist says, God is honored through his creation. All he sees as the halachic man is, now there is a shifting halachic obligation, whereas, before the sunset, I was obligated in the commandments of the daytime. Now I'm commanded in the obligations of the nighttime, and it is time to daven, the evening services. And, you read this, and from some perspective, you're like, wow, you have reduced the entire life and your Judaism to just like the utmost strictest halachic observance. On the other hand, one can argue this actually gives him the creativity to be able to describe all this interesting, mystical, philosophic, approach to Judaism and connectivity that somebody sitting there just saying, well, as opposed to praying today, I'm going to go watch a sunset and that's going to be beautiful and that's going to connect me. But there's nothing, there's no actual stuff there in order to build a connection.
Yes. You point to something very significant, which is that a traditional Jewish life and way of life is fundamentally a discipline, right? Now, of course, human beings vary as to their level of discipline, their tolerance of discipline. So they're very lax, orthodox people. And then they're very, let's say, I don't know, observant, if you will, people who call themselves or who, regard themselves as fundamentally secular. But the key here is to understand that as a group's way to approach reality, uh, the particularly the culture of the rabbis, which in some ways is founded on the Tanakh, is an application of intellectual faculties to regard the world in particular and act upon the world in disciplined ways. Yes, and so the very notion, the notion of a deracinated tikkun olam, yeah, is really not um, doing justice to the culture that supposedly undergirds it, yes, or that generated it. If you posit that tikkun olam is, I don't know, voting for Bernie Sanders, I'm sorry, but you can vote for Bernie Sanders without being a Jew. There's no connection, right? And by the same token, you can vote for Donald Trump and not be a Jew, or be a Jew. You see, it's not rooted in the fundamental understanding that you've just sketched in relation to Soloveitchik. Uh, we could talk about Soloveitchik at length. The other day I wrote, not the other day, the other year I wrote something which referred to his concept of the lonely man of faith, What I said is that essentially that there's in traditional Jewish life, there's no such thing. That's impossible. That's a modern situation. Because I was trying to explain, early modern Jewish civilization and so forth. But anyway, we've digressed as usual, and I feel a little bit out of steam. But no, wonderful, wonderful topics, and certainly much more to talk about. We didn't talk about Shlomo Molcho. We didn't talk about Abraham Cardoso versus his brother Isaac. We didn't talk about Asher Lamlein. We didn't talk about Al Roy, the Yud Ganiya, the Isawiya, all these bizarre, flash in the, or almost flash in the pan messianic movements, which are false in as much as I would argue all messianic movements are false in as much as they're not actually going to succeed.
Amazing. So when I send you an email in a couple months saying, we should do a part two of this, I'll be able to capture all that baggage of saying,
Yeah.
here are all the things we didn't discuss. David, thank you so much for the conversation.
My pleasure. My pleasure as always. Take care.